Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Dukakis Online. I'm David Wisner, the Executive Director of the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center for Public and Humanitarian Service at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. On behalf of my co-host this evening, Peter Gries, Director of the Manchester China Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this, the first of a series of events and activities which we hope to coordinate together with the Manchester China Institute. Our event this evening is rather a special event. We have with us one of the foremost experts on China in the United States today, Orville Schell, who's just released a new book. It happens to be his first novel, a dramatization of his experience in China as a young man. We are here representing the Dukakis Center, and you might ask yourself, what business does the Dukakis Center have hosting an event on China? We don't have any resident expertise on that subject. So allow me to say one quick word about the mission of the Dukakis Center. Given the mandate by Governor Dukakis himself in 1999, we aspire to inspire young people to take an active interest in public affairs. In this part of the world, that's a rather novel and revolutionary stance. And we've been experimenting with a variety of approaches with young people to get them to think that public service is, in fact, an essential part of a healthy democratic society. Michael Dukakis himself, although he's best known in the United States for domestic issues as the three-term governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has subsequently shown a great interest in China and the world. He's animated an annual series of events called the Boston Global Forum, in which China is a common topic in the discussion among the participants. And we thought, well, gee, given some of the things that he said to us in an exclusive webinar we hosted just a few days after Election Day in November 2020, the important thing to do with a country like China is to talk, but also to listen, to engage diplomatically from a position of strength, using your multilateral relationships as a thing to bring to the table, but not be afraid to hear the point of view that's offered by the leadership in the People's Republic of China. So given these basic elements, we're happy now to inaugurate a new series of events and activities at the Dukakis Center. One of the things we're just starting to do now is an internship program for high school seniors at the high school at Anatolia College, our sister institution, to get young people to begin to develop a critical sense of how to read the media between the lines, to understand the nature of the relationship, let's say, between Greece and China, between China and Europe, between China and the United States, to develop something that is lacking in the local educational curriculum. So I think I've said my piece. I'm David Wisner once again. I teach international relations at ACT. I'm happy to welcome our audience here, and I'm most happy to turn the floor over to my co-host, Peter Gries. Peter.
Thank you, David. So I am the Li Kai-hung Chair and Director of the Manchester China Institute and Professor of Chinese Politics at the University of Manchester. Just briefly, Manchester China Institute was launched nearly 4 years ago with the aim of promoting education and research about China at the University of Manchester and the normative agenda of promoting mutual understanding in UK-China relations. One of our signature programs that I'd like to share is we've just launched the 3rd annual UK China International Photography Competition. So if you are resident in the UK or China, you can use your smartphone to take a picture on the subject of what does caring mean to you? And the submission deadline is about 2 months from now. We're excited about that project, and you can Google it. I think we can also place it in the chat function. I'm not sure if participants will be able to see that or not. I'd like to introduce Orville Schell first, and then I will briefly introduce the book, and we'll have a conversation about the book, and then move on into more current affairs over the next 25 minutes or so. So Orville has been the Arthur Ross Director of the Center for U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society, I believe since 2006. He is a former journalist and then professor and dean of journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, where I believe he is now. And I'm a bit jealous myself because did my PhD at Berkeley, and I'm a huge fan of the East Bay, and I miss it. I would love a burrito right now. Anyway, he's also author of 15 books, 10 of them about China, all of them nonfiction until now. But before getting to his new novel, welcome, Orville. It's great to see you.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Pete, and thanks, David, for the introduction.
Great. So I believe the world premiere, the launch of the book was yesterday in the US at the Asia Society, a really terrific event that is on YouTube for those of you who wish to look at that. But I believe we are the UK and European premiere launch of the book, which is called My Old Home. Let's see, it's a novel I understand that Orville has been working on for 15 years now. It's his first novel. It's about a father and son, mostly in Mao's China. And I guess the first question I want to ask you about it, and perhaps thinking about why you decided to write a novel, is obviously in the context of COVID-19 and the dramatic deterioration of China's relations with the world, and especially the West, over the course of 2020. What can fiction teach us as we seek to better understand China, to manage this very difficult situation we're all in, that nonfiction cannot?
Well, that question, I think, does go to the heart of the matter. I must say that it is no easy process for somebody who spent their life in nonfiction to make the transmigration into fiction, but it was one that I actually enjoyed immensely, even as it was difficult. And I think the reason why I wanted to do it becomes abundantly evident right now. You mentioned that relations between our two countries are really at a very dismal low. And I think you have to ask, everyone has to ask who cares about this, and it's hard not to care because these are the two largest and most consequential countries in the world. Why is this so? I mean, what makes it so difficult for two countries that do share a tremendous amount of historical amity and goodwill, actually? Why are we in a train wreck now? And I think my conclusion when I started this, and actually it wasn't 15 years ago, Pete, it was 35 years ago. So this has been incubating for a long, long time within my nonfiction soul. The question was, what is it that makes this abyss so wide and widening? Surely it isn't that we aren't smart enough to think up good policies. I mean, we have the best minds in the world spending countless hours doing just that. There are other elements in the equation that, in my view, sort of gravitate around the question of, culture, psychology, I think in literature, music, and the characters in my novel are both classical musicians. There are other elements that are working here, and particularly history. And of course, you've done a lot of work in this, Pete. I mean, what is it that makes China just see red, if you may, if you will, when it looks at the United States or at Europe? I mean, this historical sort of narrative that it has about the humiliating treatment that it suffered from the West. So all of these things just suggested that they're really, for my own purposes, I needed to try to approach this topic from a very different way to kind of get some new recognitions of what it was that was at the heart of this divide.
Your comments make me think about what I sometimes think of as a failure of empathy in China's relations with the world, that we have such trouble seeing the world and various issues from the perspective of the other. And what's interesting is that social psychologists have found that perspective taking is one of the keys to overcoming prejudice in intergroup relations. And I guess I could follow up by asking you whether you think that the novel can actually play a special role in helping us with perspective taking. So your primary protagonist is Xiao Li, this young Chinese man, and yet you're writing in English to a largely English-speaking audience that then all of a sudden sees the world through a Chinese perspective. And as ugly as some of what they have to see through his eyes is, I mean, the violence of the Cultural Revolution, the devastation of the Great Leap Forward and famine, at least they're seeing the world through the eyes of the other. Do you think that that might be a special role of the novel in helping us reduce conflict?
Yeah, I do think it's, I hope so. The Chinese Communist Party officials are always saying, well, if we would only understand China better, then we'd be more friendly and get along better. But there is I hate to say it, there is an obverse sort of corollary postulate here that if you understand the Chinese Communist Party better, you might like it less. So, this is a very tricky question that sort of the contradiction can flare off in either direction. I think, one of the things that it always bewilders me about China is that the narrative of the West, sure, the West was predatory. Yes, we did have imperialism, we did have colonialism, and China did suffer from that. Certainly not as much as Vietnam, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, other full-blown colonies. It was sort of quasi-colonized. But it built out of that this whole Leninist narrative of having been preyed upon, exploited, humiliated, mistreated, disesteemed, all of these things. But the part that mystifies me is that now that China has been so successful in so many ways, this narrative of failure is really unbecoming, because in fact, you cannot demand to be equal on the one hand, but then demand to be oppressed and humiliated and disesteemed on the other. There's a contradiction at work there. So it's these kinds of questions which I think really do lie at the heart of both the struggle that my characters in the book go through, but that we in a larger sense, whether we're China scholars or diplomats or businessmen, also have to confront.
I really agree with that. I think that the victimization discourse actually contributes to a blindness among many in China to the perspectives of others. So it actually impedes perspective taking, that I think the kind of thing that a good novel can achieve is actually undermined by that kind of a victimization narrative. Getting back to the protagonist.
Just before you go on here, if I may just say that you raised the question, if we understand the other side's perspective and narrative, might we get along better? Indeed, we might. But that is a two-way street. That it isn't just a question of the West understanding China better. It's also a question of China being more open and flexible in understanding why it is that, you know, the West, whatever we mean by that, why we care so much about things like individual freedom, liberty, tolerance, you know, humanism, all of these things which the Communist Party denies as not part of the sort of universal value system. So, you know, this is an immensely complicated little pas de deux that we're dancing with the Chinese.
Yeah, I really agree. There's just a huge deficit of mutual understanding. Now, that said, there's quite a bit of mutual knowledge. So it's that distinction that's key. You know, I think a lot of Chinese argue, we know a lot more about you than you know about us. How many Americans can name 5 Chinese companies? Most Chinese can name at least 5 American companies. Absolutely. I think I would concede that there may be an asymmetry in knowledge. Chinese may on average know a little bit more about the West than vice versa, but that doesn't mean that there's an asymmetry in understanding. I think both sides are seriously deficit. And that's where we figure in. And that actually does segue into my last question about the novel, which is you chose to have Xiao Li have a Chinese father and an American mother. So he is this kind of bicultural individual standing between East and West, which in many ways is symbolic of those of us in the China studies community who are bicultural. Your late wife was Chinese. I grew up in China. But really anybody, any Chinese student who spent significant time in the West stands between. Do these kinds of figures play a specific role or a special role or have an extra responsibility in the process of moving beyond knowledge towards understanding?
Yeah, wonderful question. You know, the great Chinese writer Lu Xun had this idea that he considered himself one of these. He called it the zhongjianwu, something caught in the middle. And of course, he was caught between modernity and tradition, East and West, and you know, various other divides. But I think, as your question does suggest, that right at this point in our history, almost all of us, who, whether we're on the Chinese side or the Western side or whatever side you're on of these divides, we are stuck in the middle. We no longer can go back and forth. We can't inhabit a middle ground between the two, where we're trying to be somewhat objective, if not neutral. We're being forced to choose whether you're a company, whether your supply lines are in China, whether you're an NGO that gets kicked out of China, whether you're a journalist that can't get a visa to China, whether you're a scholar that can't do research in archives in China. The oil and the water is separating in the most alarming way. And the reason why I made my character, his mother American and father Chinese, was precisely because I wanted to embed this contradiction of being caught in the middle, right in the middle of my characters, because I wanted to sort of explore, well, what are you going to do about it? Where do you run? And I think for much of my life, and different decades, of course, there were different sort of mixes of openness and closeness in China. But for much of my life, there was a place to stand in the middle, to have Chinese friends, to go back and forth, to be able to do constructive work on both sides of the divide. And I think that sort of territory has shrunk to almost nothing. And it leaves all of us in the terrible position of not knowing what to do. So I wrote a novel.
Does that mean I need to write a novel? It is terrifying.
You may, because I think in a strange way, scholars, journalists, everybody who's wrestling with this divide have come to the end of the line. I mean, what else are we going to do about it? Dialogue. I think there's one of the immense tragedies, in my view, is that I think the Chinese Communist Party has managed to give the word dialogue a bad reputation because it doesn't do any good. We talk, we talk, we talk, we talk, we talk, and it goes nowhere. Why is that? I'm not sure I can answer it, but it's a question that is incomparable importance.
Yeah, let's transition on to thinking about the Maoist period that you describe in the book and its legacies today. What do you think are perhaps the most profound or deeply rooted legacies of the Maoist period in terms of the way your typical Chinese socialized in China today views the world? So in terms of public opinion, sort of mass attitudes, what would you say the largest legacy is? And specifically in terms of the view of the world, so international affairs.
Well, I think, to answer that question, you have to sort of acknowledge that so much of, but not all of the way Chinese see the world is conditioned by the information environment, which is really in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and its propaganda apparatus. But I think that if you want to kind of come to some understanding about what elements of the Maoist period remain, you have to look no farther than Xi Jinping. I remember, and I'm sure you do too, that in the late 70s when Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came into power, then Hu Yaobang and all of these other people, Zhao Ziyang in the 80s, that we had the rather remarkably hopeful impression that Deng Xiaoping was such a magician that he could wave his wand and make the past disappear, make the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, all of these incredibly atrocious, savage periods of history just vanish and start again. And we wanted to believe in that new future. But I remember saying, and actually being very sternly criticized at the time, I wrote a little preface to one of my books that came out in paperback saying that, the Mao Zedong is going to live on. He is deep on the genome of China's system. And, it seemed like I was utterly wrong in the 1980s, but I think Xi Jinping proves to us that when a country endures, a revolution is deep and is all pervasive as China has or Russia has. You don't just wave a wand and get rid of it. It is there, it's in history, you cannot walk away from it, and it has its own form of revenge. And I think we see that in Xi Jinping. He is a creature of Mao Zedong's, early 70s. And many of the ways he reacts, his toolkit, his reach for control whenever something is wrong is very much out of the Leninist sort of Maoist sort of cast. So I think that it's only to say that history does have indelible roots that are very hard to vacate, and it's very hard just to move on. And we see that in China today, that Mao he doesn't just have his portrait hanging on Tiananmen. He's deep in the culture. He's deep in the psyche of China, so that when someone comes along like him, and you could compare him to emperors, whatever, there are many other historical analogies. So I do think China has not escaped its history, even though we all thought and hoped it might. That's what engagement was about. You engage, you relate, you interact, and slowly China you'll bend the metal, and China will become more convergent with the world outside. But doesn't look like that's happening right now. In the long run, who knows?
Another aspect of the Maoist legacy is not just on leadership style and authoritarianism, but Mao the nationalist, and also memories of Mao as a nationalist leader I think this is something that non-experts tend to not know as much. They tend to think that the Chinese communists came to power, that the Chinese Communist Party based its legitimacy pretty much on the Marxism-Leninism. But in fact, from 1949, Mao is remembered not saying workers of the world unite, but he's remembered as saying on the launch of the People's Republic, 中国人民站起来了, the Chinese people have stood up, which was really primarily a nationalist claim. And you could argue that the Chinese Communist Party came to power primarily on that nationalist claim. And that's how they defeated their rivals, the Nationalist Party. So I guess if there's a question there, it's what about Mao the nationalist? And
Yeah.
how is that impacting China's relations with the world today?
Well, we also forget that, Mao Zedong was a child of the May 4th movement in 1919, which was fundamentally, among other things, a nationalist movement against, Japan taking over concessions in China from Germany. And I think you're right that as we even see in our own country recently with President Trump, nationalism is a very powerful sort of almost autonomic response that almost every country is subject to. And if not handled very carefully, it can kind of careen out of control. It's interesting vis-a-vis the idea of nationalism, which of course Xi Jinping has put center of his whole sort of rejuvenation, the idea of the motherland and the holy essence of what it means to be Chinese in his view. And the one element of the Chinese Communist revolution that continues is not class warfare. It's not sort of many aspects of Maoism, it's reunify the motherland. Get Tibet, get Xinjiang, get Hong Kong, get Macau, get Taiwan, and that is an almost sacred undertaking in the view of Xi Jinping. And it's why we see Hong Kong being so ruthlessly sort of torn out of its one country, two systems orbit and sort of sucked into the mainland. So it is really powerful and really dangerous in my view. And of all the flashpoints in the world that I think I worry about, one is Taiwan, and Taiwan Strait's dilemma is born of nationalism, that Xi Jinping believes that his honor as the custodian of the reunification of China must embed Taiwan in the People's Republic of China before he leaves office.
I'm struck by your use of sacred in relation to nationalism, and it brings me back to the earlier conversation about how we can be blinded to the perspective of the other, and connecting that with Hong Kong and one country, two systems. One thing that is just very, very striking is how it seems that mainland Chinese can only see the one country aspect of the Hong Kong issue. And they just seem blind to Hong Konger concerns about the maintenance of some autonomy in local self-government, which was the agreement with the UK. Do you think that sort of sacred aspect of nationalism may be particularly blinding?
Yes, I do. And I think all the more so since in the 20th century, at least, the notion of self-determination in the founding of the UN, for instance, was so important and so highlighted that a country like Canada can allow Quebec to have elections about whether it will leave federal Canada. Scotland might leave the UK. The Czechoslovakia broke up into two pieces. There are many examples where this idea of a country separating or coming back together is certainly allowable in the script of sort of modern life, but not in China. And so I think it does bespeak of a tremendous insecurity in China and a fundamental, I think, feeling in the Chinese Communist Party that it's not only disesteemed, but it is not stable unless it can execute this one big platform that remains from its revolution to reunify the motherland. And of course, it's reunifying China not on the basis of any historical, it's on the basis of the Qing dynasty. It's the largest possible footprint in Chinese dynastic history that it wants to flesh out. Not, I mean, Ming Dynasty China, as you know, was half the size of what Qing Dynasty was. It had Tibet, Xinjiang, all these constituent pieces, Mongolia, Manchuria. So I think this is we're in dangerous territory when the fundamental operating system of a leadership depends so much on nationalism.
Let's shift now over to the US. Your center at the Asia Society has worked for several years now with Susan Shirk at UCSD on this task force for US China policy that has produced a number of important reports, including the 2017 policy recommendations for the Trump administration, and then in 2019, course correction, in which the task force advocated smart competition. I guess the question I have is, what legacies do you think of Trump's China policy will end up being the most enduring? And which is the Biden administration going to be able to shift more easily away from?
Well, it's a paradox, isn't it, that even though as many people felt that Trump was a real barbarian and crude, and he was, but that so many aspects of his China policy are being maintained by the Biden administration, namely, to put it in very sort of simple terms, that there is a greater appreciation of China as a threat, if not a risk, and that there's a real possibility, whether it's in the South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, the East China Sea, that we could have a military clash, possibly even war. So I think that legacy of the Trump administration, it didn't come so much from Trump, but I think people like Matt Pottinger and the National Security Council, Matt Turpin, who had the China desk there, and various others, has, that was a little ahead of its time. And the Biden people have sort of come of age into that world of greater circumspection about China's intentions, a greater awareness that our systems and values are absolutely in contravention. And it's going to be very, very difficult to get that equation to factor out in any kind of calm and peaceful way. So that's where I think we are. And I see no evidence so far that China's willing to trim its jib in any way. So this creates what Mao Zedong liked to call an antagonistic contradiction, where the only remedy is struggle and possibly violence. I hope not, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is the final eventuality.
Maybe I could follow up a little bit with on the Chinese side. 2020, the response to COVID seemed to largely be one of denial and doubling down on the kind of more aggressive turn in Chinese foreign policy, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that became much more visible. China in conflicts with a number of its neighbors, including India to the south, and toughening policies internally in Xinjiang and right there in Hong Kong, as we've discussed. Maybe you could just elaborate on the possibilities of trimming the jib. Does it seem that at this point there's just no chance for that, given what's happened over the past year, or can we imagine a change of course, attacking perhaps to run with the sailing? Go ahead.
Well, I hope, of course, fervently that there is could be a peaceful reconciliation, but that will take diplomacy, and the fundament of diplomacy is to give a little to get a little. And if you're in wolf warrior diplomacy mode, you're probably not able to give much, and so you're not going to get much. So that's a real problem. But that's not to say that China doesn't have a lot of cards to play. You mentioned the COVID crisis. I think they've actually, they've handled it pretty well. Authoritarian governments do have a real advantage when it comes to mobilizing society towards big challenges. Economically speaking, they've done amazingly well. And I think, you know, they are still a real power to be reckoned with. So I don't view China as being unsuccessful and on the brink of collapse. However, as you point out, one of the other great mysteries is, why have they antagonized so much of the world so senselessly and towards no good end? They've completely alienated India. They've alienated Canada. They've put Australia, it'll be decades before the Australians ever warm up again to China. Sweden, Norway, I mean, you name it, and the United States. So you have to ask yourself, if wolf warrior diplomacy is a good thing, what's the benefit? What's the core interest that's served by gratuitously antagonizing people on your borders? Vietnam, I mean, you could go on. So this again, to get back to the notion of why write fiction, if you start cataloging all the questions for which there aren't any answers, you very quickly get back to some very fundamental, I think, psychological questions that relate as much to history and national character and national narrative as that we just don't have smart enough policy people to think up the right policy, and the scales will fall from everybody's eyes and they'll just say, oh, that's great, let's do that. No, that's not going to happen. We've tried it and something else is in the way.
Yeah, maybe just use a few more minutes and then I'll hand things over to David and Q&A, but just to talk a little bit more about the future, and your comments sort of raise the question that's been floating around about whether we're going to be looking at a Cold War 2.0 over the next short to medium term. And by that, I mean a transition from what has been largely a geopolitical competition and rivalry to one that has taken on the same kind of ideological dimension that the first Cold War had in the last century. And specifically, thinking about how 30 years ago, at the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama and others sort of pridefully talked about the victory of the liberal system. It was the only system possible. There are surprising echoes of that kind of liberal triumphalism in the kind of authoritarian triumphalism that is increasingly emerging from Beijing, getting precisely and trumpeting the successes that China had once it actually acknowledged the problem. It did a great job of managing the problem. And it has not just been trumpeting that domestically, it's increasingly trumpeting that internationally, which is, and basically saying, this is the system that works, and cozying up to dictators around the world, who also want to make that argument that authoritarianism works. What do you think? I mean, is a Cold War 2.0 possible with an ideological dimension? And then secondly, is decoupling possible? That's really the biggest empirical question that we're all trying to answer.
I think we all fear and hope to avoid a Cold War 2.0. But I would have to say, if you look at the trend line over the last, say, 2 years, and you just project the line out, it looks like that's where things are heading. And why is that so? Well, I think it's because we had, for many, many decades, until I think the Chinese Communist Party irrevocably put a stake through its heart, we had the promise of engagement. And what was the promise of engagement? The promise of engagement was that if we just were patient, we interacted, sent more ballet companies, more civil society, more academic exchanges, journalists, you name it, that slowly the US and China and the outside world would bit by bit become more convergent. China wouldn't become a democracy, but it was heading sort of teleologically in a direction which made it more soluble in the world outside. And Xi Jinping has ended that. So without engagement, you don't have that kind of almost wonderfully reassuring Hegelian sense that Francis Fukuyama highlighted, that the world is heading in a certain direction and China's on board. I mean, remember when Clinton told Jiang Zemin he's on the wrong side of history? Well, I don't know where history is going, but I do know that the US and China and Europe and China are on different trajectories. And so does that lead to Cold War? Well, possibly. And it all depends on whether we can get over this kind of very deep and antagonistically different ideological system of the notion of what it means to be human. Do you have rights? I mean, can you have freedom of expression? Can you have freedom of assembly? All of these things. And here it is night and day. It is one side and the other side. And Xi Jinping has highlighted the Chinese commitment to autocracy in a way that no leader before him has done. So we can no longer believe in slow convergence. We no longer can believe in engagement, and we have no operating system for the two greatest powers to get together. And you ask about decoupling, I would say, yes, it's going to happen. It's already happening. The pandemic made it happen with a vengeance. We can't even travel there. We're totally decoupled. And I think more and more you will see this happening in supply chains as well. Not completely, but, and then what? I don't know.
I'm an optimist by nature, but unfortunately, I tend to agree with you when it comes to rational analysis of the situation. But with that, I think I'd like to hand things over to David. I think we already have a number of questions lined up. So David, take it away.
Yeah, I have maybe two housekeeping items, and then we'll put two questions to you, Orville. And I've just got another one in. It's rather long. I'll try to get the gist out of it. First of all, we have an audience online here and on our Facebook live feed. From Seoul to Seattle, if you go around the world. So it's truly a global audience. Is one of the blessings, I think, of being in lockdown and using a platform like Zoom. We're able to reach out to people we wouldn't necessarily get to know and meet if we were doing things otherwise. You have greetings from the former president of Anatolia College, Dick Jackson, who knew you at a place called Berkeley, and he extends his greetings, Orville.
My goodness. You know,
I want just to extend greetings to one of the trustees of Anatolia College, David Weil, who attends our events quite regularly. We have one of the staff at the U.S. Consulate General of Thessaloniki watching, and it's Ioana Kutsunano, the public affairs officer. So hello to her. And one of the questions I'm going to put to you is from a member of our advisory board, John Koenig, a former U.S. ambassador to Cyprus. The questions, in essence, revolve around this issue of mutual understanding. So the first one is from a local here in Thessaloniki who asks, we want to think that we need to be more empathetic. Is it possible that the Chinese need to be more open-minded? And the question that Ambassador Koenig wants you to consider is whether the nationalist impulse in China is actually an expansionist or an imperialistic impulse. So I'll start with those two questions, and then we'll round up one or two more for the next round. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let's deal with the second one first, whether the nationalist impulse is expansionist. I think it's not expansionist in the sense that we sort of think of traditional forms of colonialism or imperialism that involve questions of sovereignty, of taking colonies and making them, sovereign territory. But I do think China has an abiding yearning, and this is a historical yearning that it's had for a century or more, that's been thwarted, to be influential, to have people do its bidding, to be esteemed, to be respected, to be wanted, and to be needed. And I think that is a kind of a, I won't call it colonialism, but a kind of a tie that will bind it to countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, South America. So I think it has tremendously ambitious plans and hopes for Chinese influence around the world, commercially, militarily, and otherwise. I don't think it has tremendous aspirations for territorial conquest. Open-mindedness, empathy, yeah, good traits. And I have to say that I don't find the Chinese Communist Party very open-minded. So right there, I'm not quite sure how we get through to empathy. And if you do put much stock in empathy and foreigners empathizing with China, I think there are many places where we can. I wouldn't put Leninism high at the top of my list when it comes to empathy. And I think that's a big problem. And it's not, you know, in the novel My Old Home, which actually is a very famous short story in Chinese literature, one of the things that I sort of really toy with is this difference between Mao Zedong and Johann Sebastian Bach. I mean, if there are two more different people in the universe, there you have it. One person involved with the sort of meditations on God, mortality, his inner life, and Mao Zedong on revolution and rearranging the furniture outside, totally exterior. So these are two other aspects of the two worlds which have separated into oil and water now. Xi Jinping is still very much an exterior guy. He wants to rearrange the world. He wants to rearrange China. He wants to rearrange everybody's values. And he doesn't sort of look inside. The term that Jeremy Barmay, the great Australian sinologist calls the invisible republic of the spirit. That's not Xi Jinping's world. So there's a huge division here in terms of how we look at the world, how we look at the meaning of life, of what it simply means to be human. And I don't see any way to bridge that gap anytime soon.
Let me follow up a question. We focused on China and the United States. We're here, our hosts are in Greece, and we have a broad European following. So I would be curious personally where Europe fits in this whole picture. I mean, are we thinking about the West, the United States, the Atlantic Alliance, if you will? That would be my question, a chair's question. And then I have a long question here, but it involves this.
Well, David, before you get to the long question, my poor tired brain will probably not be able to maintain two at the same time.
Okay, fair enough.
So let's quickly look at Europe. I was, for other reasons, reading some Aristotle to get us back to Greece for a moment here. It's very interesting to go back to the root of sort of Western culture and civilization to find out in that answer to that great Monty Python question of what is the meaning of life? Well, Aristotle very clearly said the meaning of life is happiness and eudaimonia. And the place you find happiness, he said, is in the exercise of virtue, arete. So here we have the foundations of Western culture in Greece, Aristotle, sort of laying out why we're alive. And this is a question I'd love to put to Xi Jinping. Why are we alive? Is it the Belt and Road? Is that what he lives and sleeps on? I mean, what's his view of these sort of rather nebulous questions? So anyway, I just raised that to highlight that our sort of fundament of our own understanding of who we are and why we're here is really born in Greece. As to Europe, I think that if there is any hope of peacefully finding an accommodation with China. It will only be in forging a closer alliance with like-minded countries in Europe. And that's very difficult because Europe is, in Sun Yat-sen's great term, Ipan Sansha, as a dish of loose sand. Even though it has the EU, it's hard for it to get together. And here I would say Greece too has a lot of work to do. You have some nice investments from China, which seal your lips in Greece. And Greece has a very hard time getting the Chinese needle out of its arm when it comes to speaking honestly about Western values. But I think we all need to ask the question of what system do we want to live under? You know, what kind of a society do we want to live in? Pretty important questions. And it lies at the root of why this is such a contentious issue and so difficult to resolve.
Okay, since we're alluding a little bit to the European Union, a question has to do with what is called the proliferation of multilateral security alliances aimed to confront a perceived China threat. And the Quad is the example that's given here. And this makes me think back to something that Governor Dukakis said to us. He says, you got to speak to China, but you have to have your house in order and you need to have your allies on your side firmly. Is this problematic for the Chinese? We're thinking in terms of international relations now. This is the question as far as I've understood it, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think Governor Dukakis is absolutely right that we do need to get our own house in order before we start preaching to others. And that is the first order on the agenda as far as I'm concerned. I also believe that he's right when he says that the best way to get along with China is to set some guidelines. And that is something that is beyond the capacity of any one nation, even the United States, to do alone. And that sort of was where the Cold War came down too, I hate to say it. But, you know, Australia can't deal with China alone. India can't deal with China alone. Japan can't. We have many alliances with Korea, with Japan, even the Philippines. And then there's the Quad with India, Japan, and Australia, the Five Eyes, you throw in Britain and New Zealand. And I do think that the most hopeful promise is in a way that's as antagonistic as possible, is for these like-minded countries to get together and forge common principles, common approaches that basically say to China, we want to get along. We'd like to have dialogue with you. We'd like to deal with climate change and nuclear proliferation and pandemics with you. However, we disagree strenuously on other areas, and these are our limits. And you cannot cross these limits or there will be consequences. I think that's the best way to keep this thing from completely coming a cropper. Will it happen? I'm not particularly optimistic because countries have a devilishly hard time of finding common interest and particularly they all trade with China and that's an incredibly important economic element that they are very reluctant to mess with.
Okay, and I have a question now that I'm fielding from one of the research associates at the Manchester China Institute, who would like you to speak a little bit about the memory of the century of humiliation and how that experience helps us understand what you call the longing for wealth and power in one of your previous books.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that Pete Gries has also ruminated on a lot, that this historical experience of being preyed upon and being weak and not being able to defend oneself is very deep in China. But it was made infinitely deeper, perhaps deeper than history justifies, by the Leninist narrative of imperialism. You remember when China adopted Marxism-Leninism in the 1920s, it got this about that imperialists were out to prey upon the world, and I won't go into that. So the real question in my mind is, yes, there's an element of truth there, to be absolutely sure. I think it's a bit overdrawn, particularly now when China is not being humiliated. It is not being preyed upon. And basically people would like to get along with it, but they're not willing to consign themselves over to Xi Jinping with, Chinese characteristics for the new era as the operating system for their own systems of societal governance. And so there is the contradiction. But I think it's time for China to let go of its humiliation narrative and its victimization narrative, because it isn't a reflection of reality now.
All right, a final question that I'll ask, and it'll again be a question, chair's prerogative here. We deal with young people, and we're asking them to read the media and try to learn to read between the lines. What are you going to tell a young person who approaches you and says, how do I get to understand the Chinese mindset, the Chinese worldview a little bit better if my means are somewhat limited? I don't have the luxury of traveling and living in China. Where do I go? What would you say to the person, besides reading your novel or your books, for example, where is a person going to get useful information about China today?
Well, I do think, you can just see behind me the number of books, and that's only a small fragment of the number of books written on China. We have no lack of knowledge on China. And I would encourage young people to read as widely as they can and not to be confused when they don't fully understand what's going on, because even those of us who spent a lifetime doing it are still somewhat bewildered by why things are happening as they are. But I do think, listen, if I knew what was going on, I wouldn't have written a novel. I think because fiction for me allowed me to ruminate on a whole bunch of issues that are very difficult to get to. The role of the individual, religion, culture, music, psychology, that are very difficult to get to through nonfiction, and many of the books you see behind me. So fiction's a good place to turn to.
Maybe I'll just jump in really quickly and add that, while we have all these sources to gain knowledge about China online, in print, it is very important to seek to move beyond mere knowledge. To gain actual understanding, you need to try to see the world through the perspective of the other. Novels are one way to do it, but I would encourage that student to seek out a Chinese person and talk with them and hear about their perspective on the world. Now, seeking that understanding is not the same as necessarily condoning the views that you hear. You are not likely to come to an agreement on issues like Taiwan and Hong Kong. However, having that conversation and seeking understanding can be the first step towards at least not engaging in a kind of hostile attribution that can make things worse and lead us to actual conflict. So that would be my intervention. David, were there any more, or are we wrapping
I just want to
things up?
say we're apparently running out of time here. I want to draw attention to the fact that the curator of the new Li Kai Hung China Gallery at the Manchester Museum, is attending Brian's Sitch. He had a question. I'm not certain whether we can field this one here. We've had some of our younger people also attending. We just want to thank Orville Schell for taking this time to speak to us in Gries. And I'll take the liberty of extending to you personally an open invitation to visit us in Greece once the lockdowns have been lifted and it's safe to travel. So thank you very, very much. I don't know if you'd like to say a last word, Peter.
Yeah, I would do exactly the same thing. Open invitation to come visit us at the Li Kai Hung building in Manchester. Terrific catching up, even if just virtually. Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations on the novel. It's absolutely terrific. And I truly do believe that novels are indispensable to achieving the kind of mutual understanding that is necessary to have any hope at all, despite the difficulty of the situation we're confronted with today. So anyway, thank you very much, Orville.
Well, thanks to both of you for having me.
Great. Okay, we'll sign off then, and we're looking forward to the next event. It'll certainly be a webinar on Dukakis Online, at least from our part. But the students are in the classrooms, and there's work to be done. We are engaged in just the beginnings of a research project with Peter Gries of the Manchester China Institute, and we'll certainly have some news about that. Okay, so I will sign off on behalf of our guests, Peter Gries and Orville Schell. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.